not in my words, not in that way, not in my name, not in my faith, not in my words, not in that way.
Welcome viewers to another edition of A Muslim's Perspective. As we know, praise belongs to Allah. We praise Him and we ask Him for guidance and forgiveness. And we seek protection in Allah from the malice of our own souls and the evil of our actions. Whom Allah guides, no one can lead him astray, and whom He takes astray, no one can lead him back to the right path. I bear witness that there is no other deity but Allah by Himself, no associate to Him, and I bear witness that Muhammad is His servant and messenger. Our guest today is Sister Sumaya Puna. Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.
Sister Sumaya represents Naseeha Helpline, and this is a crisis helpline that seeks to help folks who are having a troubled time. It could be one of mental illness, addiction, or suicidal ideation. The terms mental illness and addiction refer to a wide range of disorders that affect mood, thinking, and behavior. Examples include depression, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, as well as substance use disorders and problem gambling. Mental illness and addiction can be associated with distress and or impairment of functioning. Symptoms vary from mild to severe. With appropriate treatment and support, most people will recover. Suicide is the intentional action of ending one's life. A suicide attempt is when someone tries to end their life. An attempt often means that a person needs help and may be high risk for suicide. Suicide impacts people of all ages and backgrounds in Canada. Every day, an average of more than 11 Canadians die by suicide. For every person lost to suicide, many more experience thoughts of suicide or suicide attempts. For every death by suicide, at least 7 to 10 survivors are significantly affected by the loss. People who die by suicide don't necessarily want to end their lives. They often want to stop significant or unbearable mental, emotional, and physical pain. They want to end their suffering or to put an end to a situation that seems overwhelming to them. In 2019, 4,012 persons committed suicide, of which 3,058, 76% were males, and 954 were female, or 24%. Muslims in Canada are not immune to this phenomena. So, Sister Sumaya, what motivated the foundation or the formation of Naseeha Helpline?
I wanted to first thank you for inviting us here today. It's an important conversation for us to be having. Now more than ever, when we started back in 2006, a young group of men wanted the ability to be able to offer mentorship and support to other young people who are faced with challenges, going through high school in a North American context, but while still honoring their Islamic identity.
You mentioned North American context. That immediately brings to mind that a lot of these kids experiencing education in North America would have been raised by first-generation immigrants.
That's right.
And there would have been a one class of people, the parents, who were raised in a different cultural context.
Absolutely.
Where authority was respected.
For sure.
I speak, you obey.
Absolutely.
To what degree did you find that created issues in the context of raising kids in a public school environment where there's Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the individual rights trumps the communal rights?
For sure.
What sort of did that impact that initial spark in any way?
Absolutely. I think for a lot of young people, they're really challenged with this duality of personalities, where they're trying to honor the collective sort of part of our tradition, which, respects our elders and respects our parents and our grandparents, but then temper that with the need as a young person to assert their individuality, and then the pressure societally to kind of put yourself first and get what you need. And so that becomes really challenging for young people to navigate.
Indeed. I myself grew up in a culture of we. And I remember going to a course not so long ago, and they asked me, what makes you happy? I said, hold on a minute, I have to figure out, is there me?
Yeah.
Because in the culture,
For
it
sure.
was one of poverty.
Absolutely.
And the survival of the collective, of
Yeah.
the we,
Yeah.
was greater than the me.
Absolutely.
So everybody had to band together.
For sure.
Whereas in Canada, most parents are hardworking, and they have to essentially be providers, and they expect some return
Yeah, absolutely.
from the kids.
Absolutely.
What sort of, again, do you find that plays a role in the equation?
Yeah, I mean, I think for most Eastern traditions, not even just like the Islamic frameworks, whether it's Asian cultures or some African cultures even, where they've interacted with Muslim communities but don't specifically adhere to it, there's certainly this pattern where, you know, it takes a village to raise a child, and there's buy-in required from all parties. So that can present as pressure to young people now in North America, because the entire culture is much more sort of centered around you as the individual. And so that can actually kind of create issues with like anxiety, depression, substance abuse, some of the issues that you had actually highlighted earlier, where they're trying to kind of cope with the pressure of meeting the expectations of their parents, their grandparents, their uncles, their aunts, but then ultimately honoring who they are as an individual. And they use these sort of coping mechanisms to deal with some of the uncomfortable feelings that they might be facing.
And how does Naseeha Helpline come into the picture to aid in this period of dysfunction, in this period of turmoil in an individual's mind and heart?
Sure.
What's the process?
Right. So what we found that has helped Naseeha specifically is the anonymity and the confidentiality of each conversation, where you have a caller who can access support and just an alternative sort of way of looking at a situation or circumstance without having to worry about how, you know, somebody might interpret what that problem they're sort of facing will look like to that person. Because I think
it might be judgmental.
It might, right? And whether it's a parent or an aunt or somebody who has your best interest at heart, in the back of their mind somewhere, they might be thinking, you know, well, what will people think? And that can be harmful to the individual who's seeking out guidance and support. And we're really looking to offer, you know, alternatives to what their sort of circumstances might look like that honor their faith, that honor their shahada and their values and their traditions, while still taking into account that they are here in North America. They've been raised with different values, and you know, like, we understand those that significance as well.
You mentioned anonymity and confidentiality.
That's right.
What sort of guarantee would a potential client have that the information that they're providing you is such?
Yeah, so we were established in 2006, and there's never ever been a case of your confidential information being compromised, and we treat confidential information with the utmost discretion. We've, you know, visited young women in hospitals who have been raped. We have worked with young boys who've been molested. We've, you know, worked with families who have been physically beat up by people in public places because they are Muslim or they identify as Muslim. And we have never sort of used that as a marketing campaign or a reason to kind of support the work that we do, because to us that discretion is paramount, and I think that's why the community continues to trust us in their most vulnerable circumstances.
So I'm calling you from my phone number.
Yeah, of course.
And are you able to see my phone number?
So, like through the back line, we are able to, the administrator, but the counselor is not able to. And then that conversation will not be recorded on your phone bill at the end of the month, so you don't have to worry about a spouse or parent or other loved one sort of knowing that you reached out to Naseeha for support.
And in terms of your counselors, what sort of training do they have?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we started the peer-to-peer model, it was really just, you know, someone between the ages of 18 to 25, because our stats indicate that that's always been our primary demographic that accesses our services. But then as we found that the circumstances and the cases sort of intensified, we've had to change our recruitment to include people with more of a mental health background or profession to at least supervise the counselors. Our counselors all have a background in the mental health field, but then we also do ongoing training with them.
Yeah, and when you say peer-to-peer, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so peer-to-peer means specifically our team is, they identify as Muslim, as well as they've been raised in this environment in North America. Some of them are immigrants, so they're able to kind of speak different languages. If we have callers who reach out to us in Arabic or Urdu, and even French sometimes, and we're able to counsel in those languages.
And you mentioned a particular age group. I'm over 25.
Yes.
Can I access
Absolutely,
Naseeha Helpline?
for sure. So we answer every call. We get callers as young as 14, and then we also have parents. We have professionals like therapists or nurses calling just around other resources that exist in the mental health landscape that they can sort of offer their clients. We have teachers. We've had corporations reach out to us just around doing training for their staff as well.
Mm-hmm. So there is a degree of sensitivity on the operational side,
Right.
To these issues of mental health, suicide ideation,
That's right.
and the distress that someone feels
Sure.
on these particular occasions where they are moved to seek help.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, we have multiple platforms that they can seek out that support. We have our text support line, and then we have our helpline that recently expanded our operating hours from 12 p.m. to 12 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we're hoping to further expand those hours as well. We've recently launched our web therapy platform, which allows us to do case management now, because through the helpline, which was really just meant to be the first line of contact, now we're able to kind of have treatment plans in place for callers who are able to kind of do the work and invest in their own sort of healing and wellness. And all of our services are free of cost because we don't want cost to be a barrier to anyone.
You mentioned, I mean, mental health and anxiety and depression and all that. For someone to reach out at that moment in
Right.
time, it's a moment when they're very vulnerable.
Absolutely.
In terms of your ability to, so to speak, talk to them off the ledge.
Yes.
How successful have you been in that
Yeah,
regards?
I mean, our counselors can sort of testify to the fact that we have had callers call us when they were on that ledge. And we truly, truly believe that if, we've saved one human being, then we've saved all of mankind. And so all we can do is remind them that even though the feelings are so intense in that moment, with hardship comes ease, and like our faith is a protective factor in our mental health, and we know that our family members love us and there are people who care about us, even though sometimes we need someone to remind us of that, and to just, you know, remind people to hold on. And sometimes 24 hours can make all the difference in the world. So 30% of our callers are repeat callers, and sometimes, you know, marginalized elements of our community don't have direct access to the medical care that they need. And we try to sort of fill that gap by at least checking in on them and making sure that they're well, and they're not feeling isolated or alone.
So you would encourage someone who's feeling like that to reach out for help, because
Absolutely.
you're saying that talking helps?
Absolutely. I think talk therapy is an important model for health and healing. I think human beings need to be able to share their feelings, and they need to know that they have a voice, and they have agency in their own life. Sometimes people can feel so helpless, whether it's in a marriage or, again, in that sort of social framework where sometimes your parents or your in-laws might have more sort of weight or perceived weight in your own life than you do. And that can feel difficult, and sometimes suffocating, but you know, sometimes when you're reaching out to mainstream avenues, they might not understand the sort of context of that element, where we may, and we may be able to sort of speak to those issues in a way that kind of honors your experience.
Well, in terms of my reading, regardless of culture or religion,
Of course.
the human being mind, the mind of the human being tends towards a negative bias. If we are looking at a scene, we tend to think about the negative and you know, reflect on more of the negativity
For
than the
sure.
positivity.
Absolutely.
And it's sort of like a cycle downwards.
Absolutely.
And you're right, in terms of talk therapy, it helps.
For sure. And I mean, often we're inundated with, you know, critical voices. And we know that there's a ratio where, you know, you're going to have to say something positive 3 times to erase that one negative comment. And when you think about how negative we can be towards our loved ones, it can really make somebody feel unhealthy.
It is. I mean, you know, it's being a parent as well. You know, there are those times when you feel like you need to say, "Hey, I've been there.
Of course.
Listen to me.
Of course.
This is best for you."
Of course.
And the last thing the child wants is you know, telling that child what you think is best for them.
For sure, and I think the vehicle of information is also crucial. I think oftentimes a friend or, again, a peer support counselor could say the exact same thing a parent has been trying to say for months, if not years, but because that young person has these walls put up for whatever reason, they're just more receptive to that message from, you know, an anonymous third party than from somebody who they know or are familiar with.
Yeah, you find as well that adjusting to the environment, like for example, the normal, you concentrate on 18 to 25-year-old,
Right.
That's your niche market.
Yeah.
But in one's teenage life, you find a lot of physical, emotional changes
Of
occurring.
course.
And then you have to deal with this new experience of adulthood,
Right.
but still wanting to remain in the warm bosom of your parents.
Of course,
And,
of course.
you know, you want freedom to go where you want and to do
For
what you want.
sure.
There is these all
But
these
someone
normal.
to still do your laundry and
Yeah.
your cooking and your cleaning, right?
Yeah, and from the parents' point of view, the world is a cruel place. I got to protect you.
Of course, rightfully so. And so I think, you know, at Naseeha, we found that it's useful to always look at the family framework when we're trying to address your personal mental health, which kind of diverges from the more mainstream application of conversations around mental health, which again is very sort of individualistic. At Naseeha, we understand that you cannot thrive in an unhealthy environment, and so you have to take into account all of the other people in that household, because you know, we look at the collective and we're a product of that environment.
Yeah, I mean, I read a piece of advice recently, you know, be a warm bosom for your loved ones. The world is a cruel place as it is.
Yes.
And it's that cruelty. Then you have we're now dealing, as Muslims, we are dealing in a context and environment of Islamophobia.
Right.
Where every day your faith is portrayed in a negative light.
Right.
Do you see at your end of the spectrum this having an impact on young people and their ability to use faith to navigate their challenges in their time?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely noticed spikes in our call volume following the London incident, for example, and then other sort of Islamophobic incidents where people, you know, are afraid to even leave their homes, especially if they outwardly identify as Muslim. We have callers calling from Quebec who, I mean, I remember there was a young man who didn't even want to articulate any of his feelings or speak about what he was going through. He just wanted to cry on the line and have somebody sort of listen to his tears fall. And I think that speaks to the fact that people grieve differently, as well as young people are really sort of affected by some of these narratives that demonize their faith, but it's still a part of their identity and who they are. I mean, you know, regardless of what challenges our young people are facing, they still hold to their faith, believe it or not. I mean, it may not sort of look the way the parents would want it to. They might think, oh my gosh, you know, he's listening to music, or she took off her hijab. But the reality is, like, their faith is so deeply ingrained in everything that they do. There's a deep sense of guilt there, that if, you know, there's not a dialogue around some of those outward behaviors, it could take them down a dangerous path.
Yeah, and in terms of, you mentioned faith continuously. You know, our faith to a lot of people is unidimensional. It's only one dimension.
Right.
It's a set of do's and don'ts.
Right.
But we know from the Hadith Jibreel that it's three-dimensional.
For sure.
It's a set of beliefs, it's a set of laws, and it's also your pursuit of excellence.
Absolutely.
Ihsan. So from a faith point of view, are you speaking in terms of the do's and don'ts, or are you speaking in terms of the search for individual excellence?
Right. So, I mean, we don't sort of utilize a very rigid view of the faith. I think it really is a case by case, and I interpret faith to be sort of this individual expression between you and Allah. So, you know, there's a lot of sort of moving pieces of that, but ultimately at Naseeha, like, we don't give fatwas. If you are looking for a fatwa, we can direct you to an imam who is able to sort of do that for you. But we kind of have faith inform the conversation based on how it's initiated by the caller. If the caller, you know, indicates that they find value in talking about the Quran and the Hadith, then we will use that. In our training with the counselors, we use a prophetic counseling model where we're not here to kind of like force feed anybody faith. We follow the sunnah of the Prophet, which is, you know, to gently remind people based on where they are in that moment, because we know that it's a process that we're all sort of trying to traverse. and we try to do it with love and kindness and mercy.
Alhamdulillah. So we will speak more about the prophetic model of healing
Sure.
when we come back after this short break.
Okay.
Listeners, viewers, we'll be back with you shortly.
Thank you.
Not in my faith, not in my words, not in that way.
Welcome back, viewers. And again, today we have Naseeha Helpline, and our guest today representing Naseeha Helpline is our sister Sumaya Puna, and one of actually, I believe, the founders of Naseeha Helpline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I actually founded the Education and Outreach Department, which was just an avenue to sort of relay what was happening on the helpline to the community, because I found that there was such a disconnect between the voices being amplified and then what we were, like the patterns that we were seeing on the helpline, which indicated that young men needed to have more conversations around their own personal health. And we needed to have more sort of courageous conversations as a community with our children around issues like, so to be honest, this sort of grew out of the sex ed curriculum conversations that were happening around 2015. And we had a lot of people in our community pulling their kids out of the classrooms.
Public school, yeah.
In public schools based on, the new curriculum guidelines. But then what we found based on the helpline was that 100% of our calls from young men between the ages of 8 to 11 were around their personal body. And so we started having events within the community at the local masjids, just equipping parents with talking points on, if you're going to be taking your child out of the class, it's still incumbent on you to have these conversations around sexual health and these things that they might be exposed to, whether it's pornography on the internet or images they're seeing at bus shelters. They're really permeating our society, and so we need to be able to have these uncomfortable conversations with our children.
Yeah, there seem to be a lot of uncomfortable conversations which as parents you are thrust into. And,
Absolutely, which is the nature of parenthood, right?
Except that, parents sometimes don't even have the time to think.
Of course.
Because, it's,
I know.
As a new immigrant or as an immigrant, you're trying to establish yourself. It
Of
takes about 10
course.
years to even get back to the position you left.
Of course.
So there's a lot of hardships there.
For sure, and when I'll be honest, in 2015, I was at a very different stage of my life than I'm at now. I now have a 12-year-old daughter, and so I understand the pushback that a parent can experience, or that sort of mentality that I know it all, and the posturing that you get from young people that they don't need to hear anything from their parents. And so for you to kind of be in that driver's position to begin with is like a struggle in and of itself. But that's why I think this work is so critical, because what we found on our helpline is people are really struggling with the interpersonal relationships, and the intergeneral conflict is real, specifically with our community. And I think part of it is the fact that we're generation immigrants. I know my parents, even though I converted to Islam, came here from Guyana in South America, and a lot of the communication challenges are the same, even though they're not Muslim. They just weren't raised to talk about certain things, and I think here in North America, children expect you to have these conversations because they're having them at school, or they're being asked to have them with guidance counselors, and then the guidance counselors, for example, can't answer their questions in the context of their faith identity. So even though they don't want to admit it, they're looking for direction from their parents and loved ones.
Scenario.
Yes.
I'm a young child, 15 years old. I'm reaching out to Naseeha Helpline.
Right.
I'm having problems at home. I'm
Yeah.
unable to articulate my problems.
Sure.
Do you just speak to me, or would you reach out to my parents?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would maybe, and it wouldn't be me, I don't answer the calls, but the counselors would talk you through potential sort of like tips or talking points to start the conversation with your parents, to maybe help you articulate some of those feelings that are getting stuck in your head right now, to maybe help you label some of those feelings and help you understand why. Sometimes they're just like, I'm so mad, and you're like, okay, but why are you mad at your parents? And then when they stop and think about it, well, this thing happened when I was like 8, and I never really told them how much it upset me, but it actually bothers me to the point where I can't even look at them anymore, right? But it's not until they kind of organize their thoughts in that way that they can kind of now go to the parent and say, look, like I'm having a hard time here and this is what I'm dealing with.
Do you have parents who are giving you a backlash and say, what are you telling my kids?
No, thankfully we have parents calling us saying, look, my child is having a hard time. How do I help them navigate this difficult time? Can you talk to my child, for example? And then our response is, we're gonna need your child to call in, because ultimately, and we know this even as parents, as much as we wanna do the hard work for that person to get better, nothing you can do can get that person better. That person has to be able to do the work themselves for them to heal. So sometimes making that call is the first step or act towards getting better.
I'll share something with you.
Yeah, of course.
As an 11-year-old,
Yeah,
first year high school,
yeah,
my favorite cousin
yeah,
hanged himself.
yeah.
And I wish he had a Naseeha
That's very generous of you, and it's humbling.
to speak to.
Of course. And we have
14-year-old kid.
I know, and it's still happening. I mean, we've gone to schools in the US where, and oftentimes what we've seen in our work at Naseeha is one person will die by suicide, and then there will be copycat incidents. And you'll have other young people around them that will just be reeling and plummet into a downward spiral because they don't know who to talk to, right? And sometimes just letting go of those feelings can free you and be liberating.
So many times as adults, we forget what it is to grow up. And, we don't realize the psychological or what is playing in the minds of kids. And as parents coming from a certain cultural background, your thoughts and your minds, get out of here.
Yeah, of course. Of course.
We're not touchy-feely.
No, for sure.
And it's great that a service like Naseeha is here with us today in our community where there's so much adjustments that needs to take place generationally, as well as in terms of the individual physical and mental development.
Absolutely.
And health in itself is not only about physical health.
That's right. Yeah, no, I think, we're at a crossroads where our community needs to be able to level up in a larger Canadian sort of context. And I don't think that will happen until we sort of address some of these systemic challenges that we're facing. And, we have a lot of different pockets of our community who have come from war-torn places.
Traumas.
And there is trauma everywhere. And, people are expecting the kids to kind of like go to school, sit in class, pass their classes, and it's not that simple. And you're right, I think often we can marginalize the needs of our loved ones. And you need an independent third party to just kind of reset that playing field and center their experience, and then bring them up to a level where they can have a conversation and defend themselves
and become less emotional over it.
No, of course.
And
for
more
sure.
rational.
For sure.
Yeah, indeed. In terms of the numbers of people reaching out to Naseeha on a monthly basis,
Yeah.
do you have some numbers you can help us
Yeah,
with?
for sure. So this year we've experienced a rise in call volume, and we're now accepting about 650 calls a month, and around have 100 text conversations in a month. And the text conversations usually take about an hour in length, compared to like a phone conversation, which averages between 20 to 30 minutes. So we've had to increase our staff to support the fact that young people prefer texting as well.
It's more anonymous.
Yeah, for sure.
And in terms of those 600, 700 people, which works out to about 25 persons a day,
Yeah.
you know, what's the gender breakdown? What's the age breakdown? Any idea?
Yeah, for sure. So typically we have about 60% of our callers are female, and then 30 to 40% identify as male. And then I know this past month there's been a bit of an increase in calls from females. And to be honest, I'm not sure. Typically, women are calling about their, again, relationships, whether it be spousal or domestic. And then the age range, we have about 50% of our callers are between the ages of 18 to 25. I think about 20% of our callers are between the ages of 25 to 35. About 10% of our callers are above the age of 35. And then the balance is below 17.
And are these callers only in the GTA or across Canada?
So we get calls from Halifax, from Nunavut. We actually get international calls a bit as well. We get, I would say less than 10% of our calls are international. Roughly 50% of our calls are from the US at the moment. So
you reach
and we've
into the
never
US.
marketed outside of the GTA, but there's clearly a need for this type of faith-based, you know, and I caution myself when I say faith-based counseling, because again, like the component of faith is really based on the individual's need, but I think it's important that our young people know that there's an alternative method that honors that part of their identity.
And typically, what sort of issues would have to be dealt with?
Yeah, so I mean, people call about substance abuse. They call, I mean, you name it, we've heard it. They call about, and a lot of these people are sort of dealing with pre-existing conditions like depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation. You know, since the pandemic began, we've had more people calling around where they can kind of get in touch with a shelter or with food service. They want to sort of be triaged to who to speak to if they have COVID, for example. So we have gotten everything and anything. And sometimes, you know, someone can say they're calling about food support, but then end up having a conversation about how they found out their wife has been cheating on them. So we try our best to kind of just listen actively and have that conversation be directed by the caller. And, you know, if they need additional resources, we provide them with that. And then if they need to kind of further sort of explore some of what they're dealing with, they're welcome to call back anytime.
So in terms of, you say call back, is there any follow-up that you do initiated from Naseeha Helpline?
No, so the call has to be incoming at the moment.
Yeah.
It's really only web therapy, which you can register for on our website, and then that will sort of be case management.
Other than that, it's the individual calls in to Naseeha.
Yeah, and if it's a repeat caller, sometimes what will happen is we'll have a case number that they can reference, so they don't have to sort of explain their whole backstory.
So you do document, some sort of documentation.
So each call is logged, and each text conversation is kept just for liability purposes, but that data is not shared with any
Yeah, no, but
party.
if I call and you give me a case number,
Yes.
I can say I'm calling, I have a case number,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
you're able to refer into a database.
That's right. That's
Pull
correct.
that up so you have a continuity.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah, we don't have to start from.
Square one.
And you know, in terms of your own counselors,
Yeah.
I'm sure they would have faced a lot of traumatic
Yeah,
calls.
vicarious trauma.
How do you handle their trauma? Because when you receive news like that,
Yeah, for
you
sure.
know,
For
you
sure.
also are impacted by it.
Absolutely. So, I mean, our turnover is pretty much, you know, I think people can essentially do maximum 2 years of this work. Often in our recruitment, we'll have new candidates sort of fall off because they come thinking that they're going to, you know, be changing the world, and people are going to be calling about issues like taking off the hijab, for example, or I don't know, like, you know, mundane issues, what dua to read, for example, before an exam. And we do get those calls, but overwhelmingly now the majority of calls have to do with acute issues like incest sometimes, molestation, family violence, rape, so
It takes a toll.
it does, for sure. I mean, we've had our counselors sort of get emotional without letting the caller sort of know, but need to kind of like, after the call has ended, just take a moment. I know some of our counselors go for walks to kind of clear their minds. They have a registered social worker available in-house that they can talk to if, you know, they feel the weight or the burden of these conversations weighing heavily on them. You know, if they say it's too much for us, we try to just take them off of the helpline and repurpose them within the organization for a while and then put them back on when they're ready.
Yeah, it's dealing with the mind is a very,
Absolutely.
very traumatic thing. And when you deal that with as you say, some of these things like incest and you know, some of the really gory stories,
Yeah,
it can also impact those who are receiving,
for sure.
you know, the calls.
Undoubtedly.
So talk therapy for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely, definitely. We have, you know, considerations put in place, and then we have the professional developments. With COVID, it's been tough, but in the past, we've had sort of monthly hangouts so that they can just have a positive space where they can kind of relax and take a load off. And, you know, I think that the alumni now, I mean, we've been in operation since 2006, and so I think we've almost become brothers in arms because we've sort of carried the secrets of the community for a few decades now.
Yeah, 15 years at
And I
least.
think it gives you perspective. You could see somebody on stage somewhere or at the supermarket and not have any clue what that individual is going through behind closed doors.
We all have a story to tell.
Yes, and so you're mindful of that now.
Yes, and in terms of, you said that you are involved in education and outreach.
Yes.
I mean, we know that COVID has placed physical constraints.
Yes.
Do you have programs that reaches out and actually goes to masjid, speaks to imams
Absolutely.
and speak to kids and stuff?
Yeah, so we were recently contacted by the Peel District School Board and the York Region District School Board to provide programming for their students and staff. And that's going to be coming up in coming months. We recently did an Instagram Live on September 11th, just around the mental health impacts that 9/11 has had on our community, and that was well received. And then, you know, we did programming during Ramadan, and we plan to have monthly sort of schedule of activities virtually, and then pick up with the MSAs. We've done circles in the past that were on site, And we're hoping to be able to do that again in January when kids are on campus again.
Yeah, hopefully there's no other variant that shuts
Absolutely,
us down
for
again.
sure.
Because that as well, I'm sure, has impacted people's mental health. The
Absolutely.
shut-ins and the lockdowns.
Yeah, well,
and
for
the,
sure.
You know.
Especially,
Yeah.
I mean, we actually had an increase in our elders calling during the winter months because they're confined to their homes, they don't have cars, they don't really have people to check in on them regularly. So we had to kind of pivot for a short period to make sure that we were working very closely with the local food banks to make sure that these individuals had food delivered to them regularly, and that they were able to get to their medical appointments, and that they just had someone to talk to in those lonely, dark months.
Yeah, alhamdulillah that you're there for them. Do you recruit volunteers?
Yes, for sure. So if you're interested in volunteering with the organization, you can email us at info@naseeha.net. Alternatively, I mean, the website is probably the best way, but you can also email me directly at Sumaya, SUMMAYAH, period Poonah, POONAH, @naseeha.net.
And how do you get funding to support all of this wonderful work?
Yeah, so I mean, for most of our history, it's been privately funded, but I would say since last year, we've started sort of receiving grants from organizations like the United Way, like other social service agencies and charities in our community. And then just recently, we received funding from the Bank of Montreal, and some of the other banks have sort of stepped up to support some of our community programming.
So you accept donations from the public as well?
Absolutely, yes. No, I mean, that has really been the backbone of how we've been able to do our work. And it gives us that flexibility of, you know, prioritizing the needs of our community because there's not like governmental funding, for example.
You're a registered charity.
We are a registered charity in Canada and the US.
And if someone wants to get more information, you mentioned a website. Could you mention
Yeah,
the URL?
absolutely. So our website is www.naseeha.net.
Inshallah. Sister Sumaya, so grateful that you can join us today and to feature Naseeha Helpline. It's great work. You know, so many of our community's activities is about raising funds to build masjids or to buy masjids, you know, concrete and mortar. But so little is invested in the human capital. And there are two ends of the spectrum that suffers from that, the young people and the women.
For sure.
Because masjids tends to be a place where for males to go and hide out or to worship and so on and so
Or
forth.
socialize, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, it's fantastic that
They have
an initiative like this, where we can really invest in human capital, in the raising of our children, and in you know, someone who is in need of help
No,
at
I
a
hear
crisis
you.
can have someone to speak with. I think that's something which we should all encourage and support in every which way. And I'm so happy that you and our brother Yassine took this initiative so many years ago, and all the best.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
viewers, until next week, thank you very much for tuning in. Until, peace out.
Not in my name, not in my faith, not in my